The hallway was narrow, but Rick made it feel like a coffin. He was looming over me, all 6'2" of retired military ego, screaming so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He was going on about respecting the chain of command in his house, his face turning, a dangerous shade of red that usually made my mother shrink into the wallpaper. But I didn't shrink. I just stood there, feeling the familiar cold calculation wash over me, the same focus I used when authorizing a strike. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my back pocket. Rick flinched, expecting a phone or maybe a middle finger, but instead, I pulled out a simple black leather wallet. I didn't say a word as I flipped it open, letting the hallway light catch the gold emblem and, more importantly, the common access card inside. The bold letters O-7 and the silver star seemed to suck the air right out of the room. Rick stopped mid-shout, his eyes bulging as he tried to process the impossible math staring him in the face. I locked eyes with him, my voice barely a whisper, but hitting harder than his shouting ever could. "Colonel, you are currently obstructing a flag officer," I said, stepping forward. "Stand aside." He thought he was disciplining his girlfriend's unemployed, lazy daughter. He didn't realize he was trying to give orders to one of the Pentagon's highest-ranking assets, a woman who authorized operations he didn't even have the clearance to know existed. To understand how he made the biggest tactical error of his life, we have to go back to the day I moved back in. I had come home for one reason. My mother needed help recovering from hip surgery, and I was the only one who could take the leave. But to Rick, my presence was an invasion. I was in stand-down mode, wearing oversized hoodies and sweatpants, hiding the deep exhaustion of a 9-month classified deployment where I hadn't seen the sun for days at a time. Enter Rick, my mother's new boyfriend. A man who believed a crisp uniform was the only measure of a person's worth. He looked at my baggy clothes and saw a failure. A 30-year-old drifting through life with a remote computer job. He didn't know that my computer job involved directing naval cyber warfare operations. To him, I was just a mess on the couch. The tension snapped the night he hosted a dinner party for his old army buddies. The house was filled with cigar smoke and war stories, and Rick was in his element, holding court at the head of the table. Then, he pointed a fork at me. "And that's Sarah," he announced with a sneer, introducing me to a table of strangers. The squatter finally came out of her cave. The table erupted in polite, uncomfortable laughter. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a quiet, seething rage. I commanded a task force of 300 elite operators, yet here I was being told to clear the plates like a servant while they discussed real sacrifice. I silently stacked the china, my knuckles white, listening as Rick leaned in to whisper to a retired major on his left. He didn't bother to lower his voice enough. "Don't mind her," he said, gesturing dismissively at my back. Soft generation. She wouldn't last a single day in basic training. I paused in the doorway, the stack of plates trembling slightly in my hands. I wanted to turn around and tell him that I skipped basic training because the Navy needed my mind more than my marching. But I didn't. Not yet. Life under the roof of Colonel Rick turned into a bizarre, suffocating pantomime of military discipline that I hadn't agreed to join. He didn't just want me to live there, he wanted me to enlist in his personal, petty little army. He instituted what he proudly called his barracks regime, which meant 0600 wake. Up calls where he would literally pound on my bedroom door until I verbally responded. He demanded rent not in cash, but in humiliating menial labor, scrubbing the baseboards, organizing his garage, and polishing his collection of commemorative coins. I did it all with my head down, biting the inside of my cheek until it bled, reminding myself that this was temporary. Just until Mom was back on her feet. He loved to lecture me about the chain of command, waving his finger in my face like a metronome. He constantly referenced his rank, reminding me daily that, as a retired colonel, an 06, he was a man of significant stature who demanded absolute subservience. It took every ounce of my training to keep my face neutral. I wanted to scream the truth at him, that in the active duty world, an 06 is middle management, while I was an 07, a Rear Admiral lower half. In the actual hierarchy, he should be standing at attention until I gave him permission to speak. But I couldn't say a word. I just nodded, playing the role of the invisible, disappointing daughter. while my internal ledger burned with the injustice of it all. The insults were personal, aimed directly at what he perceived as my failure as a woman. He would look at my lack of a husband and children with open disdain, calling me a career failure over breakfast. "You're 30 years old, Sarah," he'd say, shaking his head as he buttered his toast. "No ring, no prospects, just staring at a computer screen all day. It's pathetic." He saw a woman who couldn't catch a man. He didn't see a woman married to the job. A commander who had sacrificed personal connections to ensure national security. But once I closed my bedroom door and turned the heavy deadbolt I'd installed, the narrative flipped entirely. My room wasn't the messy den of a teenager he imagined. It was a fully operational, temporary skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility. On the desk sat 3 hardened laptops and an encrypted satellite phone, the only lifelines I had to my real life. While Rick was downstairs watching cable news, I was logging into the secure network, staring at real-time threat maps that would have given him a heart attack. One Tuesday afternoon, the gap between these two worlds threatened to tear me apart. I was commanding a global task force via a secure video link, managing a critical situation involving a hostile nation-state attempting a zero-day exploit on the eastern seaboard's power grid. On my screen, I had the faces of my team, elite operators stationed in London, Canberra, and DC, all operating under the 5 Eyes protocol. My second in command, Commander Lewis, a man who didn't sweat unless the world was ending, looked pale on the monitor. "Admiral," he said, his voice tight, "the malware is propagating. If we don't isolate the node in 60 seconds, we lose the grid. Awaiting your authorization for a level 5 cyber interdiction." The room was silent, the air thick with the hum of cooling fans and the weight of millions of lives. They were waiting for me. They didn't see a daughter in sweatpants. They saw the director of naval cyber operations. They feared me, and they respected me. I leaned into the mic, my voice steady and cold. "Authorize level 5, I began. Initiate the kill switch on my mark. 3, 2, bam, bam, bam." The door to my room shook violently on its hinges. I froze. Rick's voice roared through the wood, shattering the atmosphere of the command center. "Sarah, I know you're in there. The kitchen trash is full and I told you the truck comes in 20 minutes. Move it." The absurdity of the moment hit me like a physical blow. I was literally seconds away from preventing a foreign power from turning off the lights in New York City, and this man was screaming at me about garbage bags. Commander Lewis blinked on the screen, his eyes darting to the side, confused by the shouting in the background. I didn't flinch. I hit the mute button with a practiced finger, stood up, and walked to the door. "I'm coming, Rick," I yelled back, pitching my voice to sound compliant and cowed. I waited for his heavy footsteps to retreat down the hall. I sat back down, unmuted the mic, and looked at my team. "Apologies," I said, my voice dropping back into the steel register of command. "Local interference. Execute the interdiction immediately. And Lewis, if this fails, prepare yourself for an admiral's mast. I want that grid secure." I watched the code execute, the threat neutralize, and the green lights return to the board. I had saved the country. Then, I stood up, put on my slippers, and went downstairs to take out the trash. Rick loved to talk about the chain of command. He didn't realize that in the food chain of the U.S. military, he was a shark. But I was the ocean. For weeks, the house vibrated with Rick's indignation about the upcoming Joint Chiefs Gala. It was the premier black-to-tie event of the season, held at the nearby base, a gathering of the true military elite that Rick felt entitled to attend by virtue of his past service. But the reality was harsh. He had been retired too long, his clearance had lapsed, and, without a current sponsor, he was just another civilian on the wrong side of the gate. He paced the kitchen, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen that the new military had no respect for legacy officers. "It's all politics now," he'd grumble, slamming the fridge door. "Men of honor are left out in the cold, while politicians rub elbows." I listened to him rant while I scrubbed the countertops, feeling a familiar cold idea take root in my mind. I knew I had a reserved table at the very front, table 1, that was currently empty because I hadn't planned on attending. But looking at Rick, a plan formed. Not an emotional outburst, but a surgical strike. I wiped my hands on a towel and said, casually, "You know, Rick, I think my boss might have a spare table. I can probably get you in. He laughed, a short, barking sound of dismissal. Your boss? He sneered, looking at me like I was a child offering to pay the mortgage with Monopoly money. What is he, some mid-level IT manager with a corporate sponsorship? This is a high-security event, Sarah. You can't just buy a ticket on the internet. But I saw the hunger in his eyes. He was desperate enough to take a handout from the failure of the family if it meant getting into that room. He snatched the offer with a grunt, assuming he was doing me a favor by accepting. I didn't argue. I just went upstairs to my room, locked the heavy deadbolt, and pulled out my secure satellite phone. I messaged Lieutenant Commander Davis, my flag aide, a man who would jump in front of a train if I ordered it. I typed out a simple, precise command: Operation Humble Pie is a go. Secure very important person transport for Colonel Vance. Seat him at my table. When I handed Rick the envelope a few days later, his eyebrows shot up. He read the gold embossing on the heavy cardstock, Admiral's Circle. For a second, he looked confused, his brain trying to reconcile the ticket with his low opinion of me. Then, the arrogance settled back in, smoothing over the cracks. Your boss must be a heavy donor, he concluded, tucking the ticket into his shirt pocket like it was his birthright. Money buys access, I suppose, even for civilians. At least I'll be there to show them what a real officer looks like. He spent 3 days polishing his medals and lecturing me on protocol. He had no idea that the protocol he worshipped was about to crush him. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and dress blues, humming with the quiet, potent energy of people who make decisions that change maps. Rick entered the room like he was inspecting a regiment, his chest puffed out in his vintage mess dress uniform, the gold braid on his sleeves catching the light. He was in his element, or at least the element he pretended to own. He snapped his fingers at a passing corporal who was carrying a tray of champagne, barking a criticism about the spacing of the young man's ribbons. I walked a few paces behind, silent and unnoticed, watching him treat the lower, enlisted staff with the same casual disdain he usually reserved for me. He was playing the part of the distinguished war hero, completely unaware that the stage was about to collapse beneath his feet. The usher, a sharp-eyed lieutenant, led us through the crowd. We passed the standard tables, then the very important person section, and kept going until we reached the very front of the room. Rick's confident strut began to falter as we approached table 1, the head table. This was the Holy of Holies, reserved for the highest echelons of command. Rick stopped dead, his face draining of color as he looked at the placard. He grabbed my mother's arm, his whisper frantic and edged with panic. "Sarah, this is a mistake," he hissed, looking around nervously, as if expecting security to tackle him. "This table is for flag officers, generals and admirals. If we sit here, we're stealing a seat from a 4-star. We need to move, now." He turned to bolt, but a rigid Marine guard stepped into his path, blocking his retreat with a chest like a granite wall. Rick started to stammer, his arrogance dissolving into the terrified obedience of a man who knows he's out of his depth. "Son, there's been a mix-up," Rick pleaded, sweating now. "I'm just a retired colonel. I can't sit there." The Marine didn't blink. He looked down at Rick with zero emotion and said, "Please remain seated, Colonel. The host requests your presence specifically." Rick sank into the chair, trembling, convinced he was walking into a trap. He reached for his water glass, his hand shaking so badly the ice clinked against the crystal. Then, the lights dimmed. The master of ceremonies' voice boomed over the speakers, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he intoned, the authority in his voice silencing the room instantly. "Please rise for the host of this evening. The Director of Naval Cyber Operations, Rear Admiral Sarah Jenkins." Rick froze. He was literally mid-sip, the glass halfway to his mouth, when the name registered. He choked, a violent wet cough that he tried desperately to stifle, his eyes bulging as he stared at the double doors. They swung open and I stepped into the light. The hoodie and sweatpants were gone. In their place, I wore the pristine navy dinner dress whites, the fabric sharp and immaculate. On my sleeve sat the broad gold stripe of a Rear Admiral. My chest was heavy with ribbons, campaign medals, commendations, and the Distinguished Service Medal, each one a receipt for a sacrifice Rick had mocked as computer games. The sound of 300 chairs scraping against the floor filled the room as generals, senators, and commanders snapped to attention. It was a wave of respect that started at the back and rolled forward. But Rick didn't move. He sat there, paralyzed by a shock so profound it had severed the connection between his brain and his legs. I walked slowly toward the head table, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't rush. I wanted him to see every inch of the uniform. I wanted him to see the reality of who I was. I stopped directly in front of him. The entire room was standing at rigid attention, waiting for my cue. Only one man was seated, Rick. He looked up at me, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of absolute crushing cognitive dissonance. He couldn't reconcile the stepdaughter he bullied with the Admiral standing over him. I looked down, my face stone cold, stripping away every layer of his ego with a single glance. "Colonel Vance," I said, my voice low but carrying the weight of absolute command. "When a flag officer enters the room, you stand, and you salute." The order hit him like a physical blow. He scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair back in his haste, his face flushing a deep, humiliating crimson. He threw up a salute, but it wasn't the crisp, arrogant gesture he used in the hallway. It was stiff, terrified, and desperate. His hand quivered at his brow. I let him hold it. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable, forcing him to stand, in the posture of subordination in front of the very people he tried to impress. Finally, I returned a sharp, dismissive salute. "As you were, Colonel," I said coolly. "Sit down." He collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. I took the seat at the head of the table, smoothing my napkin over my lap, signaling to the room that they could be seated. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been obliterated and rebuilt with me at the top. He didn't speak for the rest of the night. He just stared at the gold star on my shoulder boards, realizing that every insult he'd thrown at me was a court-martial offense waiting to happen. The drive back from the base was a study in atmospheric pressure. For 40 minutes, the car was filled with a silence so dense you could almost reach out and choke on it. Usually, a car ride with Rick was a monologue, a running commentary on other drivers, the state of the roads, or a critique of whatever music I tried to play. He filled every empty space with his voice because silence forced him to think, and thinking was something Rick avoided when it came to me. But tonight, the only sound was the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional click of a turn signal. I sat in the back seat, watching the back of his head. He was rigid, his neck muscles tight, staring straight through the windshield like a man driving through a minefield. He looked like he had seen a ghost, or rather, like he had realized the ghost he'd been haunting was actually the one holding the keys to the castle. Beside him, my mother was practically vibrating. She kept twisting in her seat to look at me, her eyes wet and shining in the passing streetlights. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. She was beaming with a vindication she hadn't even known she needed. She knew I was successful, sure, but she hadn't known this. She hadn't known that the daughter she worried about was the woman General stood up for. I looked out the window, watching the suburban houses blur by, and felt a strange, quiet peace settle in my chest. For years, I had carried a mental ledger of every slight, every interruption. Every time Rick had talked over me or dismissed my career as a hobby, I thought about the time he made me move my car so he could park his truck in the garage because work vehicles take priority. I thought about the dinner parties where I was the punchline. Tonight, that ledger didn't just balance, it caught fire. I didn't need to say a single word to defend myself ever again. The silence in the car wasn't empty, it was the sound of Rick's entire worldview collapsing. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the old habits tried to assert themselves one last time. We walked into the house, the familiar smell of floor wax and stale coffee greeting us, the scent of his domain. Rick, still in a daze, unbuttoned his mesh jacket and started heading toward his bedroom. The hallway was narrow, the bottleneck of the house. It was the same spot where, just hours before, he had physically blocked my path, looming over me to scream about authority and respect. He stepped into the center of the hallway out of pure muscle memory. He was a big man, and he was used to taking up space, used to people shrinking around him. I didn't shrink. I kept walking, my dress shoes clicking rhythmically on the hardwood, the gold stripes on my sleeve catching the overhead light. He heard the sound, authoritative, steady, approaching. And he turned. For a split second, I saw the old Rick start to form a scowl, ready to demand I wait my turn. Then, His eyes dropped to my shoulder boards. The scowl disintegrated into panic. It was visceral. He didn't just move, he scrambled. He flattened himself against the drywall, sucking in his gut, pressing, his shoulders back as if he were trying to merge with the plaster. He made himself smaller than I had ever seen him, terrified that even. A brush of his fabric against mine would trigger a catastrophe. He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the floorboard, his voice cracking, stripped of all its bluster. After you, ma'am. The word hung in the air, ma'am. Not Sarah. Not the squatter. Ma'am. I walked past him without breaking stride, without even a nod of acknowledgement. I didn't need to gloat. The sound of his fear was loud enough. I moved out the following week. My mother was fully mobile again, and my deployment to the suburbs was officially over. I packed my equipment, the hardened laptops and the satellite phone, leaving the room exactly as I found it, empty. But I learned quickly that a man like Rick doesn't change his nature, he just changes his tactics. About a month later, I started hearing rumors through the grapevine. Rick was down at the VFW, and suddenly, the narrative had shifted. He wasn't complaining about his lazy stepdaughter anymore. He was bragging. He was telling anyone who would listen about his girl, the Admiral, implying that he had been my mentor, my guide. He was using my rank to try and score better tee times at the base golf course and secure discounts at the commissary. He was trying to cash in on the very success he had mocked, attempting to withdraw prestige from an account he had never deposited a single ounce of support into. It was the ultimate insult. He wanted the glory of the rank without the guilt of the abuse. I didn't call him. I didn't text Mom to complain. I handled it the way an admiral handles a security breach. I contacted my JAG officer, a sharp-witted lawyer who lived for protocol. We drafted a formal cease and desist letter. It wasn't a family note. It was a legal document on Department of the Navy letterhead. It cited unauthorized use of military affiliation for personal gain and vaguely hinted at an investigation into stolen valor by association. It was cold, precise, and terrifying. My mother told me later that when Rick opened the certified mail, he turned the color of gray ash. He sat down at the kitchen table, reading the legal jargon that threatened his pension and his reputation, and he didn't speak for 3 hours. The bragging stopped instantly. In fact, he stopped talking about me entirely. He never raises his voice in that house again, haunted by the knowledge that the girl in the hoodie was watching, and she had the power to dismantle his world with a single signature. Rick loved the hierarchy until he was at the bottom of it. He learned the hard way that true authority isn't about how loud you yell in the hallway. It's about who stands at attention when you walk into the room. If you've ever had to hide your success to survive a toxic environment, let me know in the comments. And remember to subscribe, because here, excellence is the only rank that matters.